program. My name is Courtney Cowart, and I'm the director of the Society for the Increase of the Ministry. I just want to welcome everyone. It is so great to see many old friends from the Faith Farm and Food Network days and the Cultivate days back at Swanee, and also to meet so many new people. I wanted to say a little bit about why SIM is hosting this. In 1857, the Society for the Increase of the Ministry was founded as really the first leadership development organization of the Episcopal Church. And over the years, we've understood our mission to be both identifying leaders and aiding leaders of the church in that archaic Victorian language, obtaining a thorough education. We understand this to mean both scholarships to folks who are from all three orders of ministry who are seeking a formal theological education, but also we see it as lifting up leaders in our midst and connecting people in our congregations and in various parts of the church who have wisdom that we can all benefit from in terms of guiding and increasing our ministries. Right now with the COVID pandemic, I feel like there's really a particular opportunity in this time and with this technology to form an ongoing online leadership learning community where we can all learn from each other, and that we can do that in ways that will help us all. And so in that spirit today, we are welcoming our guests, Rose Hayden-Smith and Brian Sellers-Petersen, to talk about why it is that everyone should know how to garden, and the fact that we actually all really can do that. And if we did, we would be able to create a sustainable food system that would feed everyone. So it seems obviously that this is very connected to the work of the church. I'd like to introduce Mike Longworth, who's identified as SIM Ministry, who's supporting us technologically. My colleague, Jim Goodmann, who's been my associate for many years and who works with me here at SIM, the chair of SIM's board, and also the rector of St. Andrew's, Yardley, Pennsylvania, Hilary Greer, and our panelists, Rose and Brian. But first I'm gonna turn it over to Hilary to describe a little bit about how we're gonna actually host this conversation. So Hilary, take it away.
Well, it's wonderful to be gathered with people from coast to coast looking at this really critical question for us. And as we're considering food and agriculture together, we're bringing our whole selves into this space, even though we log in on Zoom and see each other in these small little boxes that contain at best our head and shoulders. We're bringing our entire body, our hearts and our souls into this. So the way that we have structured the webinar today is to start with an opening reflection, which Jim will lead, and to then start with some dialogue with Rose and Brian about what the situation is in our food systems today, what the potential is for the future, and how that might impact both the food movement and those of us who just want to figure out how to start growing some food. And then we'll take a brief break. We'll continue to weave in some time for spaciousness to really let what they said sink in. And then we'll come back for a time of question and answer to be able to hear more from each of you. Because this is done as a webinar and not as a regular Zoom call, we'll only be able to see these 6 panelists together today, but we will be able to hear you and would love to hear from you in the chat box later. And Brian will also be telling us at the end about some upcoming plans for continued ways of gathering among those who would like to continue to engage with these questions. So thanks very much for joining us. And Jim will now lead us in our opening reflection.
Good afternoon. I'd like to invite everybody to just relax into this space. Maybe take a few deep breaths. And as you would step into a different room and leave other things outside. And I have a poem to offer from Wendell Berry. It's almost like a little anthem. You know, we do anthems at offertory as a prelude to communing. So I'd like you to listen to this little poem. Learn by little the desire for all things, which perhaps is not desire at all, but undying love, which perhaps is not love at all, but gratitude for the being of all things, which perhaps is not gratitude at all, but the Maker's joy in what is made, the joy in which we come to rest.
So now I'd like to introduce 2 extraordinary people who I think know quite a bit about the Creator's joy. Rose Hayden-Smith is an Episcopalian and an active member of St. Paul's in Ventura, California. She is also an emeritus advisor with the University of California Cooperative Extension, and I've asked her to tell us more about what that is. She served as 4-H director, master gardener, program coordinator, and director of the Cooperative Extension Office in Ventura County. She also led the University of California's statewide initiative in sustainable food systems. She is also an author and an historian who has studied food movements in the course of American history and published Sowing the Seeds of Victory, American Gardening Programs of World War I. And we welcome you, Rose. We also have our dear friend, Brian Sellers-Petersen, largely to thank for this gathering. Brian seems to know everyone in the food movement in this country, both in the Episcopal Church and beyond. We are familiar with his book, Harvesting Abundance. And we are extremely fortunate that Brian is a senior advisor to SIM. And so we work together every day, which is a great joy. You know, mostly throughout his career, he's well known for his work with Episcopal Relief and Development, but also with other international relief and development organizations. And he is a member of the General Convention Task Force on Creation Care and Environmental Racism. So thank you, Brian. Thank you for being here, for your wisdom, and for helping to pull all of us together. And now I'm going to turn it back to Hilary to begin our conversation.
Thank you. Rose, could you talk a little bit to open us off of what the current situation is that you see in terms of our food system in this country, and how you see it impacting, over the next 3 to 6 months, our food system?
So much for having me. I'm just so thrilled to be here. So, what I've really noticed, and I think all of us are seeing, is that the things that we're learning about, packing houses, the spread of infection there, and those being shut down, and not only the workers, but there have been over 100 USDA inspectors who have fallen ill with COVID-19 as a result of being in these packing houses. And I think what those things that we're seeing, the sort of supply issues with groceries, really highlight the sort of lack of resiliency that we have in our food system, which is pretty concentrated, pretty consolidated. We're also seeing real brokenness in terms of food access, and specifically, how do you feed children who are getting 2 meals a day at schools? How do you get that out? And communities have had to respond in different ways. The sort of surge of demand at food banks. I mean, we're just seeing a lot of brokenness with the system. That's my first takeaway. My second takeaway is that local food has really emerged as a star. In California, where I am, farmers markets really quickly responded, and they have all over the country, and they've developed distancing measures and CSAs. Local food is going to be, I think, in the next 3 to 6 months, people are going to really realize how essential to our food security, local and regional food systems are. So that's another thing I've noticed. The third thing that I think has huge implications is this surge of interest in gardening. And as someone who specializes in the history of victory gardens and sort of gardening during crisis in this nation, this interest is unprecedented, and it's being driven by a lot of different things. And I think this is going to carry forward. And it's going to have some implications, and there are possibly going to be some policies that come out of it nationally. And it's a wonderful opportunity and a great place for our church to be, and for faith communities to be in general. The fourth thing that has really amazed me, as someone who has spent their career, almost 30 years, working in the food system and the food movement, is if you had told me in December that workers in the food supply chain, farm workers, workers in packing houses, grocery workers, delivery people, that they would be being elevated as heroes, and that my 18 and 20-year-old friends who are co-members at church with me would be getting hazard pay for working in food service. I would not have imagined that to be a possibility. And I think that this moment actually is another thing that won't go away. And I think it really presents an opportunity for equity, and for increased equity and awareness going forward.
And what potential do you, both Rose and Brian, see for the larger food movement in this country that has been advocating for decades for localized food sources, for smaller scale, more sustainable farming practices? What do you think the opportunities are in this moment?
I'll take it from a very narrow perspective. The Episcopal Church, which probably about 95% of us are connected to in one way or another on this conversation. But I think it's fair to say that we probably own more land, private land, per communicant member than any other church in the country. And we have a lot of underutilized land, a lot of unused land, a lot of human resource that's sitting in the pew that we rarely ask to help us, as a part of our food ministry. We are essentially a food religion. We're an agrarian religion. We culminate, our worship in something around a dining room table. And so it's in our very fiber and being. And I think this presents us huge opportunity to really leverage our assets as a church. Just so many acres of land that can be put into production in a variety of ways, in partnership with other faith communities, but also every other member of civil society. I think as I've observed, the most successful church garden and agrarian ministry things going on in our church are the ones that really develop partnerships with a variety of people in their own communities. There's a couple people on this call from New Canaan, Connecticut, that they've managed to get the junior league involved, the local nursery involved, the Boy Scouts, you name it. And I think that so many of the people who have active agricultural ministry in their churches, food ministry in their churches, who are on this call and beyond, have that, the successful ones have that community partnership. And I'll let Rose comment on extension in particular, because I think that that's an asset that we all have at our disposal that we don't use.
Well, I think everything Brian said is amazing and accurate. And I think that my politics are food and gardening. And a lot of this is actually going to hinge on the election. I think that there are enormous opportunities that will take place around sort of civic and social reconstruction that are going to involve food and gardening, and especially local and regional food. I think that that's going to be going forward really an important part of our recovery. I think that gardens as a site of sort of civic renewal and kind of civic engagement, I think that's going to happen. I also think too that we are going to see, there are going to be some significant changes, I believe, in higher education that potentially may have impacts in our nation if we have the foresight and the vision to engage hundreds of thousands of young people whose lives have been disrupted by this crisis and who may be rethinking what their path is for education and service to the nation. And if we have the vision and can harness the resources to capture that energy and that talent and that creativity, we may really be able to remake our communities in fundamental ways. I also think too that this is going to, crisis is really bringing back a sort of focus on practical skills. I mean, people are baking bread, they're sewing, and this sort of thirst, they're gardening. And that's where extension comes in. And I think that extension could be a wonderful partner for us going forward. And for those of you who don't know about cooperative extension, it's a a local resource that brings your university to you, that is basically a partnership between the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Land Grant University, and local government, typically a county government. And they run 4-H programs, they run master gardener programs, they work with farmers, they do things with natural resource management, nutrition. And in fact, another way for us to connect with Extension, not only to get technical expertise to support our projects, would also be to connect with them through nutrition, because in many states, Extension is the organization that provides the education piece for what is called SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which people used to call food stamps. And so Extension would be a great organization for us to partner with. I think probably a lot of congregations have master gardeners in their midst and may not even know.
And along that line, now going back to the church side, we've got a phenomenal number of bloggers and authors actually on this call, and I'm going to send out a few things on chat, but we'll also be collecting information that we will circulate of resources within the church as well, to help with that. Just in terms of ideas, inspiration, and so I will be doing that during the course of the next 45 minutes, just sending out some things, take some screenshots while you're at it. And then the other thing I wanted to mention, sometimes when I talk about church, we think about just our local congregations. We also need to think about all the variety of ministries that go on beyond the church that are connected to what we call the Episcopal Church. And I'm thinking about schools and seminaries, camps and conference centers, monasteries. Many of those different organizations are represented on this call. Especially grateful to see friends from the Episcopal Camp and Conference Center group that are participating today. And many of them are resources. Anyone in the Diocese of Los Angeles or San Diego know already that they have an incredible resource at Camp Stevens in terms of learning about agrarian ministry and how to do things. And many of their children have learned about growing food at camp. And we'll be hearing more from that organization in the coming months as they really rethink how they do business, as many of them are having to cancel their camp programs this year.
So I'm hearing you say a few things. That first of all, we have a lot of land in the Episcopal Church that we can be cultivating. Not only in our congregations, but in other camps and so forth, that we can partner with Extension in our county, and that we might also perhaps be able to partner with an organization like AmeriCorps to bring in young people to help us do this work and do this cultivation. And I have to say, Rose, when you say that, it reminds me of when I was in New Orleans after Katrina, and so many service volunteers and service corps from all the denominations came and helped, gut the houses and rebuild the city. Sometimes so many would be in town in a week. The only place they could meet was in the Superdome. Yeah. So, I mean, I've actually seen this happen with my own two eyes, even though it sounds almost impossible. It really is possible. And so I hear all of this, and I'm wondering what you would say what do you think our next step should be, both as individual congregations or faith communities who want to get started with this, and also as people who want to advance a movement that's a justice movement in some ways?
Well, I think that we have to first of all figure out how we can do it safely, right? Because we're going to be in the midst of this crisis for a while. We're going to be in the midst of this crisis for a while. I think we need to figure out how to do it safely. I think that we need to identify partners in each of our communities and collaborators, and they're going to be different. But I think that the opportunities for faith communities to partner with public organizations like Extension, and with programs like Food Corps, which is an AmeriCorps program, with our own church service organization, right? I think the opportunities are tremendous. And I think that what we also need to do is make sure that we connect with our local food pantries and food banks, because there may be things that they want us to grow for them, that we are connected to local gleaning organizations. In Southern California, where I live, that's Food Forward. And we've had them out to our church to glean from fruit trees. The extension office that I'm affiliated with has a farm. We had to cancel our farm field trips. So we harvested, and Food Forward came and took, and we distributed about 2 tons of fruits and vegetables to our community. And so I think, that we need to do that. We need to be able to do work that we can scale and, start small, but hopefully scale up. I would say that another really critical thing that we could be doing now would be to connecting our theology with sort of gardening and agricultural, the agrarian piece, and that part of that might even be, offering to all of us some sort of curriculum for Sunday school, a curriculum for teens, a curriculum for families, for young adults, so that we have experiential education as well as spiritual education and formation around this topic, and how we do it ourselves and how we do it in communities.
This is Brian again. I'd like Rose to talk about the place of propaganda from a historic context. And I'm referring particularly to the plethora of posters that were produced during World War I and World War II. We've got artists and propagandists who are trapped at home right now, and how can they be contributing? So I'd love to hear what you have to say about that.
So in my book, I write a lot about the posters that were used to drive the Victory Garden programs in World War I and World War II. And I know you've all seen those posters, and some of them are really amazing. And what the US government did is they actually got nationally known artists to volunteer their time to create these posters. And, because there wasn't, especially in World War I, there were very limited forms of mass media. Posters became a form of mass media. And people really engaged around the art, and people still do. And I think the idea of using our incredibly rich artistic and creative tradition to develop art that we can then share on social media that clearly communicates what it is would be a wonderful idea. And one of the things that I will post on the Facebook page is in the next couple days, and this is also a call to action for you to go like the Facebook page if you haven't liked it already, and that I'll drop some posters from images from World War I and World War II, and I'll give you some caption information so that you can see the hidden messages. But I do have to tell you that my favorite poster is from 1919, World War I, and I'm sure you've seen it. It's called Food Commandments, and it's just the list of 5 things, and it just says food at the top. And one of the items is to buy local foods. So we think that local food is a new thing. It's not. I mean, that was part of the strategy in the World War I Victory Garden campaign, was to buy local food.
And Rose, you've talked before about the importance of government policy, and you sort of named it briefly at the beginning. Can you talk just a little bit about government policy, particularly in those World War I? The Victory Gardens, which you've said before, could be a really great model for us now. And also just a little bit of background on the legislation that created the land grant universities as just very concrete examples of what government policy can and has done for food production in this country.
Sure. So in World War I, the Bureau of Education in the United States, it's a federal agency. They had done 3 years of surveys on school garden activities in the United States before we entered World War I. They had a lot of data about who was gardening, what schools. It was a school garden movement in the United States prior to World War I was enormous. And so they actually developed and launched a curriculum which was a softly mandated federally for urban and suburban youth that was focused on gardening and agriculture. And Woodrow Wilson thought it was so important to teach kids about gardening and agriculture that he funded it with money from the War Department. So that was one sort of federal policy that made an enormous difference, right? And it came through the idea of education and public education, but also linking kids with civic organizations outside of school. A second policy that the federal government used in World War I was not food rationing, but food conservation sort of soft policies, where people would take food pledges and commit to behaving in certain ways, sort of like positive social pressure. And the results were actually pretty remarkable through gardening on the home front, food conservation, and food like preservation measures. The U.S. was actually able to increase exports of major commodities by about 3 times in a period of 16 months. And so I think that was one way that propaganda and sort of government policy worked well to achieve goals. In terms of the sort of legislation that could provide infrastructure for us, that goes back to 1914, something called the Smith-Lever Act, which basically created something called a National Cooperative Extension Service, with the idea that organization would take knowledge, technical knowledge from universities, and work and live in communities to solve issues together. And one of the early focus of the Cooperative Extension Service was actually to improve production agriculture in the United States and to sort of make it more technologically, improve it, increase production, increase efficiency of production, reduce costs for farmers, things like that. And the way that that policy worked was that they couldn't always get to farmers, so they got to farmers' kids through 4-H, and then the parents would come and learn, and they also did what they called home economics, right, and home training. There's the master legislation for all that, of course, is something called the Morrill Land Grant Act, and that was signed by Abraham Lincoln in 1862. And I really struggle with that personally. There's a lot of tension around that legislation for me because it did envision public higher education, but they stole land and then gave it. So it's kind of the origins are not, it's tension for me, but it did create the land grant universities that were originally envisioned by Lincoln to focus on agriculture and mechanic arts. And so that was a first attempt to sort of democratize higher education in the United States.
The same thing can be said about the Episcopal Church in terms of our land and how we acquired our land, and how can we really start talking about acknowledging the land that we are on, in terms of the tribes, and I think that's important. But how can we see redemption and reconciliation as a part of what we're doing, and really making an effort to connect with the tribes, the local tribes, the historic, tribes that were once on our land as a part of our work. I think it's a whole nother subject for consideration, but I think we need to know our history. And I think, Rose has been really fantastic for the food movement in helping draw the lessons, both, the lessons we have learned and the lessons we don't necessarily want to emulate, but we can still draw inspiration from.
Well, this is fascinating to me to think about the advocacy piece of all of this, that there's a community organizing and advocacy dimension to what we're talking about as well. But I wanted to kind of pivot for a minute and acknowledge that Hilary Greer shared with us some materials that are being developed by DFMS and on creating good news gardens. And I don't know if Jerusalem is here on the call. Is she? Does anybody know? Yes, she is. Jerusalem, would you like, I feel like it would be so important for everyone to know that this is coming. So I would love it if we could unmute you for a minute and ask you to say a word about these materials. I know Rose said she was super excited when she saw them, and so are we.
Great. Thank you, Courtney. And Eric, can y'all hear me? Am I good? Okay, good. And Rose, this has been amazing. I'm so grateful to connect with you and everyone on this call. So I'm Hilary Greer. I'm the staff officer for evangelism in the Episcopal Church. And together with the Creation Care Department, Melanie Mullins and Phoebe Chatfield, we are launching somewhere around Labor Day weekend. We're shooting for Ascension Day and partnering with the Rogation days on the liturgical calendar. But we're really hoping at least by Labor Day weekend to launch what we're calling the Good News Garden movement. And what this is, it's absolutely modeled in a large part on the Victory Gardens. I was a history major in college, with World War II domestic initiatives kind of being my sweet spot. So this is definitely inspired by that. But what this is this is a movement that we are asking people to join, from the individual at home all the way to a commercial, someone with a commercial farm or agricultural endeavor. So imagine what I'm going to describe to you being offered to you at your home, your church community, Episcopal, camps and conference centers, a local community garden, all the way to a commercial endeavor. And what we're going to ask people to be a Good News Garden, to join the movement, is to commit to 3 things. First, to plant, and to plant more than they would normally, whether that's starting from scratch, starting a window box of flowers or a container garden of herbs, to going ahead and planting an extra row or an extra plot to what they would normally do, in order to somehow share the bounty, whether that is selling at a farmer's market and then turning that money around and giving it to a food bank to use as they need, or whether it's putting that money in a food bank, or just sharing with your neighbors, or sharing with your local school feeding program, whatever that looks like for you. Or maybe it's just sharing the beauty. Maybe you live in an urban area and it's just a way to begin to share natural beauty. So that's the first one, is to plant. The second commitment is to pray, for the justice issues around the food systems, to pray for the right use of land in these situations, and for everyone who's impacted in the growing, the picking, the selling, the harvesting, the distribution, right? So there's going to be some specific prayer language, but that's the heart of that commitment. And then the third one is the proclamation, to proclaim the good news of doing this work by sharing your story on social media, with friends, taking pictures of your garden progress, connecting other people with the Good News Garden movement, inviting conversation around that sort of thing. And so when people join the Good News Garden movement, they'll be able to get different things. We're going to have graphics that you can have printed up in yard signs, so that you can put a yard sign in your garden, badges you can put on your website that says we're a Good News Garden, and then and those sorts of social media things. And then additionally, we'll be sending out a monthly newsletter and probably contacting a lot of you for content around that. Again, that we believe that formation piece is a huge part of this work. And so to begin with, there'll be a monthly kind of scripture prayer reflection on way of love in the garden. So where do we find prayer in the garden? Where do we find worship in the garden? Those sorts of things that people can reflect on themselves, do some share with other people, as well as practical resources. Everything from, how do you start a garden, as well as sharing resources that you guys are sharing with us through the new Agrarian Ministries Facebook page, to any kind of activism that rises up from this. We'll stay in touch with like OGR and the work that they're doing, the Office of Government Relations, and that sort of thing, connecting with people who maybe want to get involved in their extension programs, or the food corps, those sorts of things, trying to make sure we provide those resources monthly. So we are very excited about this. Had a great call earlier today with our communications team, and Rose will probably be excited to hear that our graphic designer is taking her cues from those vintage posters. I know. So we're really excited. She got really excited about it. And so whatever the Good News Garden logo looks like, it will definitely be a nod to those wonderful Victory Garden posters. So that's coming up. So you'll probably start to see and hear about that in the next couple of weeks, and look for those invitations, and spread the word, spread the good news.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jerusalem. That's really exciting to hear about. And Brian has been posting a number of resources in the chat box. After this call, as he said, we'll be sending out an email with ways for people to continue to connect. And so look for that. What we're going to do right now is just take a break. This has been a lot of information to process. So we invite you to the Japanese, inspired by the Japanese practice concept of ma, which is the empty space that then allows things to take form within. So we'll take about 2 minutes, and you're invited to stand up from your computer and especially to look out the window and reconnect yourself with the earth and what we're talking about here. I'll time it. It's 3:47. At 3:49, you'll hear my voice calling us back together again. So please take a moment of spaciousness. And when we come back together, we'll have about 15 or 20 minutes of question and answer where you can type questions into the chat box and for our wonderful panelists. So thank you. We'll take a break. Friends, we'll start to regather. We'll come back to our tiny boxes on the computer screens, which contain a wonderful community. And it's great to be here together. There was a question typed before we went to break asking how people sign up for emails from Jerusalem. So Jerusalem, if you wouldn't mind, if you're able to answer that, or we can put that information in one of the emails that goes out. So we welcome anyone who would like to ask our panelists a question today. Or if you have questions for each other panelists.
Well, I'm going to make a quick plug. I'm grateful to Nuria Parrish from Plainsong Farm, who is sort of getting way ahead in piloting the Good News Gardens in the Diocese of Eastern Michigan and Western Michigan, who have the same bishop now. But she has agreed, along with Jerusalem, to do a webinar sometime in the future, really talking about Good News Gardens and about, we have a lot of churches that have been doing Good News Gardens, in a sense, for years and decades that will easily graft on to this. And I think I mentioned somewhere about Googling COVID Gardens Episcopal Church and finding many churches that are doing COVID gardens. And I'm really grateful for an example set by Episcopal Ministries of Long Island, who gave a grant to St. Peter's in Bayshore to start a COVID garden. And I think they're on the call. And I'm hoping other funding organizations will consider helping local congregations with capital expense to do that. So just stay tuned. We have all your email addresses, so I'll bombard you with announcements once we have the details for Nuria in Jerusalem.
And Hilary, we have a question from Tamara Plummer, which I can pose.
That would be great.
Okay, so can you talk about the two types of food systems where stuff is being thrown out on one end and then you can't find food in the supermarket? What are some immediate ways for folks to help in this area, if at all? Thanks, Tamara.
Okay. Well, I think you know, the food system is really complicated, and we've all seen these distressing photos of milk being dumped. You know, and this would remind us of what happened during the Great Depression, where we had, you know, overproduction, but there are hungry people, and so the federal government has made some funds available to buy some commodities from producers and get it to people. So we may hopefully be seeing fewer of those examples in the media in upcoming weeks. I hope so. I think that the more complicated issue is how we structure the food system. I think that there are actually, you know, there are a couple of different food systems. You have your more local and regional, and then you have your larger food system, but they do connect, right? And one of the things that we can do is we can plant and grow if we're able to. We can buy local. We can also watch food waste, right? Because really, a lot of food waste happens at the family level, the personal level. In terms of these larger sort of food systems issues, I actually think that these are going to require some significant changes in the policies, and that's going to require changes in the Farm Bill. And for those of you who are interested, there was a really good article that just came out that talks about the Farm Bill through a lens of equity. And I would be happy to drop that link on the Facebook page. It's a wonderfully researched article. I don't think that there are any quick fixes for this. You know, we only do a Farm Bill every 5 years, and it's probably the largest federal omnibus bill that we do.
But I have a follow-up question. You mentioned at first about how organizations can act as a kind of go-between between the producers who can't get their product to distribution and the people on the ground in communities who need food. I mean, could churches function as that kind of intermediary?
Yeah, I mean, I think churches could function as that kind of intermediary. In certain commodities, producers won't actually have the option to sell because they already are contracted to say, if you're a hog producer, you might already have a contract with Smithfield. So you may not be able to sell. But I think churches could serve as that sort of intermediary in the food system. Another thing too that I would really like to give a shout out to churches to consider doing is that there are hundreds of thousands of 4-H kids who have raised livestock for their county fairs, and they're not going to be able to see those projects through to the county fair. And in our county, one of the things that happens that's a great benefit all around is that the buyers buy the animals from the kids and they donate them to the local food bank. So we're actually anticipating another huge hit for our food bank. And so if there's any way to tap into 4-H organizations and see if you can be a connector between 4-H kids and food banks potentially, that might be something that you could do as well.
Wonderful. And we have a couple of questions in the chat box. There's one from Emily Zimbick Rogers asking, can you talk about starting gardeners gardens for those who are really beginners. And as a total beginner myself, what I'm taking from this call is to connect with our local food pantries and to ask what they would like us to grow, which gets to a question that Laura Evans also wrote about sometimes food pantries not accepting fresh grown produce because they can't track it back. Churches, as ways of kind of aggregating food, what we do for all of the groups that we donate to, they do have a way of tracking it through us. So having the church as the intermediary creates can create a tracking mechanism for those food programs. Doing sort of an asset map of who's in our area, extension, master gardeners, 4-H programs, and connecting with them. And I know Brian has some good resources to send out about that. What other advice would you give for those of us who are completely new?
Yeah, well, I would be very remiss and the Episcopal asset map. It is really important to log on to, and I don't know if Tamara Plummer is still on the call, who works with Episcopal Relief and Development. Maybe she could say something about that as a way for us to network, to identify resources in our own communities. That's particularly important.
Yeah, and one article that Brian, I think you posted on the Cultivate Facebook group from New York Times is excellent, and we'll make sure that's included in the links that's sent out to everyone. I found it a very excellent way of finding what zone you're in, what food can easily be grown in your zone, and even times of year when you can plant it. So that for those of us who really don't know anything, it was a very easy resource to use to start some food production.
You know, in many of our churches, we have master gardeners. Yeah. And I like to say that master gardeners like to hide their light under a bushel. and so you gotta sniff them out and, embarrass them if you have to. But they're usually more than willing to lend a hand. But they get relegated off to some other ministry in the church, and we forget that they are a gift to us as well. So find those master gardeners in your church, and many people who have started gardens in our churches and other parts are master gardeners themselves.
There was also a question on here about, I can't find it, but it was asking if we'll match make with some people, or, I mean, really the question is how can people connect with each other and start building a network? And I know Brian and Rosa are both working on something related to that. Can you talk a bit?
Yeah, so another thing that I want to suggest that churches could do, and like for the first time ever, that was not my dog. So I'm really happy because usually I have the really barky dogs and the other panelists have heard them. So one of the things too that I could recommend is that for a congregation that might just be starting out, just propagate seedlings into little pony packs, right? And then even in the time of COVID, if you have seedlings, you can advertise that and set up a safe giveaway where it's a drive-through giveaway and people are taking the seedlings. And I know that during this crisis, we did 1,000 pony packs from our farm that Master Gardener volunteers propagated for us. And that would be a wonderful thing that you could do. And the German, that's pretty easy. It doesn't take a ton of space. And that would be a good way to start, to be giving resources to empower others to go out and do this work.
California had a COVID, let me start that over again. couple weeks ago, St. Andrews in Fullerton, California, had a COVID garden or Victory Garden drive-through where people could drive through and pick up starts and seeds. Google that, and you could see what they did. It might be a great thing to emulate throughout the country.
I would love it if, I know we've mentioned safety a couple of times, and when I try and imagine, you know, as a newbie getting started on this and having to worry about social distancing on top of everything else, I think, Brian, haven't you been doing some gardening with folks out there, but social distancing while you're doing it? Or has anybody, I mean, who has some ideas?
Well, there is one of my fellow parishioners here in Roslyn, Washington, Jenny Kreckling, has been doing a lot of the gardening, her and her husband Mike, and really doing social distancing. And I think that there's a way to do it, maybe bringing your own tools, making sure you have a jug of Purell around, and just sort of keeping your distance. There are state restrictions and to even gathering on church property that we have to be attentive to. And so I think that there's ways to do it. And just, it's a matter of being creative and being safe and following all the state guidelines in terms of gathering. And it might just mean one person at a time going to the church garden to work and having things set out.
Yeah, that was, I think it's going to be a real challenge moving forward. And I think some of the things that people are outlining in the chat about the signups and alternating people, those might be strategies that would work. Again, one of the things that I really liked about what St. Andrews did in Fullerton is they had a local arboretum, and the arboretum wasn't getting visitors either. So they partnered together and created these to-go resources to sort of extend the ministry to the community. And I thought it was a really remarkable model, and it's been so successful that they're repeating it. And especially because right now, as anyone who's a gardener knows, it's been really difficult, or more difficult than usual, to get gardening supplies, right? There's been a real run on them. And I think that, you know, organizing resources for people would also be a really good way to do it in this sort of uncertain time when we're not back fully to where we want to be.
Do you think we're going to have food shortages this fall and winter?
Well, I think that we might have shortages of certain kinds of foods. I mean, I know that I've got friends who live in other parts of the country who've messaged me and said that their meat is being rationed, right? Like they're limiting. And even stores now, like even if you're using something like Instacart, stores are putting their own per limit on it, right? Like 2 cans of kidney beans and things like that. I think that there are different kinds of food shortages, right? I mean, I'm really privileged. I'm not going to go hungry, but food security right now, acute issues around food security in parts of my community and in communities all over the nation. I was just reading a Washington Post article yesterday about Chelsea, Massachusetts, and, you know, people are going hungry. And so, you know, food shortages, I mean, it's going to be weird because we also have, you know, certain things are not going to be able to be imported or exported. And I think that there are places where you're maybe going to have a lot of stuff, and then places where you maybe don't have as much of that stuff. So I think we're going to feel it very unevenly around the country. But I think that one of the things that we should be very sensitive to is that people are hungry now. Childhood nutrition is getting bashed. I've got a friend who lives in Kentucky, and her school district did a yeoman's effort. They had the school bus driver go and deliver the lunches, the breakfast and the lunches, to kids in the community. But what was in the breakfast and lunches was highly processed, right? And so then you're adding more to that health inequity, and we know that the differences in that the health inequities are also creating huge mortality differences with COVID-19, right? And so we're then packing more into that health inequity. And so I think that we need to be very concerned about the hunger piece, and that needs to be something that we get really active in. And I just think about what Adlai Stevenson said, that a hungry man is not a free man. A hungry man is not a free man.
I think we need to start thinking towards the fall in terms of what we start harvesting. And, we jokingly talk about our church aging, but some of our elders are expert at food preservation. And, we need to, sort of plan on having canning seminars at our churches, and, building our church pantry, for the winter when things get scarce at the food banks. Food banks can direct them, to get canned goods from us. There's more and more ministries that I'm discovering that are doing, hunters and fishermen that, are ministries, and that they, preserve the fish and the game and donate it to food banks. And I'm especially thinking of someone in Nuria Parish's diocese, Christian Barron, who's very involved in that. He likes to show off all his fish on Facebook from time to time, that in turn people in the community are able to eat.
And I think, Brian, you're right. Food preservation is something we really need to focus on. And by the way, Extension has master food preserver programs. And so they also teach those skills. And, there are another resource I want to direct you to is Oregon State University has an online basic vegetable gardening course that would work well for many different parts of the country. It's free right now. They've had, in the first 2 weeks of the COVID crisis, they had, I think, 19,000 new registrations for that course.
Great. So one of my main takeaways from this webinar is how much there is to talk about, and how many wonderful people and communities working on this are here together. And when Sim put together this webinar, it was very much with the intention of helping to pull together a network of people, which Brian has been very much doing, starting the Episcopal Agrarian Ministries page and other work that he's doing. And we do hope to continue this conversation to many of the comments and questions about how we continue to learn from each other. Brian, can you talk a bit about what some of the next steps and upcoming plans are for that?
Joining the group page and just starting to build an online community and conversation, and just getting to know each other and sharing, what you're doing. We learned how to better use technology to build community, and I think that this is an incredible opportunity as it relates to agrarian ministry. And I think we'll be here, it's more in terms of not a network or a new organization, but building a movement. And I will be, and along with Jerusalem and Phoebe from the presiding bishop's staff, we will be posting things on the Facebook group page about what different organizations are doing. I think we'll be hearing more, especially I know that Episcopal Relief and Development and Episcopal camps and conference centers are working together on things, and that all of us will need to know about. And we all need to remember our camps and conference centers during this time. I think they can be terrific partners. And so I think it's how do we build a movement? And I think we're all a part of that.
And I believe, Brian, you have plans for an upcoming Zoom call as well as a webinar with Jerusalem and Nuria. Is that true?
Yes, we will be, and stay tuned. There will be some announcements going out in terms of a next webinar with Nuria and Jerusalem to talk about this new Good News Garden movement, and stay tuned in terms of other activities in terms of building this larger movement. And in particular, this is just a snapshot in time, but will live forever. Mike has recorded this webinar, and all of you who are still on the webinar right now, I hope you will take the link and forward it to people who are interested in the subject, who weren't able to join as a way of building a movement.
Excellent. Well, I think it's probably time to draw this to a close, and to say thank you to everyone who joined, and particularly to our panelists, and to invite Jim to close us, with a poem that feels like the perfect poem, not only for this moment and this time in our country's life, but for this movement. So Jim, would you please draw this space to a close and
Sure.
share that with us? Thanks.
Thank you, and thanks to all the panelists. This is an excerpt from Wendell Berry's poem Manifesto, The Mad Farmer Liberation Front. And remember, as Emily Dickinson said, much madness is divinest sense. Love the quick profit, the annual raise, vacation with pay, want more of everything ready-made, be afraid to know your neighbors and to die. And you will have a window in your head, not even your future will be a mystery anymore. Your mind will be punched in a card and shut away in a little drawer. When they want you to buy something, they'll call you. When they want you to die for profit, they will let you know. So friends, every day, do something that won't compute. Love the Lord, love the world, work for nothing. Take all that you have and be poor. Love someone who does not deserve it. Denounce the government and embrace the flag. Hope to live in that free republic for which it stands. Give your approval to all you cannot understand. Praise ignorance, for what man, what woman has not encountered that they have not destroyed? Ask the questions that have no answers. Invest in the millennium. Plant sequoias. Say that your main crop is the forest that you did not plant and that you will not live to harvest. Amen.
Amen. Goodbye, friends, old and new, and we will look forward to gathering again.